start now. We've got Michael Bradley here to discuss is there a Britishness to reclaim? There'll be plenty of time for contributions and discussions. We'll just get people to come up to the front because it's got to come through the microphone to be recorded, hence me having to stand up. Okay.
Well, as the song goes, 40 years of pain never stopped them dreaming. And I suppose we've just been through another World Cup and another disaster for the England team. Some of the highest paid players on the face of the earth spent several weeks running around like a park football team, except for in the last game where Wayne Rooney was sent off and then he suddenly got the Dunkirk spirit for the last half an hour. But we've obviously been through a period where in most areas the St George's flag has been flying around. I know certainly on the estate where I live there's predominantly the St George's flag, actually a large number of Polish flags as well up where I live and stuff, and actually the flag has been fluttering from people's cars and the rest of it. I want to make one bold point to begin with, really. Personally, I don't believe this has been about an outbreak of support for fascism amongst the British working masses. I don't think everybody who's worn an England shirt and stuff has necessarily sold out to Thatcherite values. Actually, I sat on a train the other day having a chat with 3 young Bengali kids, all wearing England shirts, off to see the England-Ecuador game, really, and stuff. And that's one point I wanted to say, really. Even last summer, despite the horrifically sort of class inbuilt nature of the game of cricket and the fact that in some grounds there is practically a colour bar that goes on, really, and stuff, I don't believe that everybody who watched the Ashes and wanted England to win either and stuff was necessarily a Tory voter. And in fact, when you see the pictures of some of the big screens, right, and stuff up around the country in Leeds and other places and stuff, when you do get black and white people jumping up and down on the rare occasions that England scored, but for stuff, it does show something that we don't live simply in a country that is completely segregated of black and white, where there can be Muslim and Christian on the same event and the rest of it. These in many ways are positive things, really. But the main point to say, really, I suppose, is we're not really just talking about how much support we did or didn't give to Sven and the boys over in Berlin. What we're really talking about is something much more fundamental, is that we're meeting 1 year and 1 day since the bombs went off in London, that we're meeting at a time when British soldiers are dying in Afghanistan and Iraq. The first British Muslim soldier died a few days ago, and when Britishness is no longer really the preserve of the BNP or the Norman Tebbits of this world with his cricket test. In fact, if you think about the people who raise the idea of Britishness at the moment, predominantly it is people supposedly of the left, Gordon Brown and David Blunkett being named among them, and sometimes people with more left-wing credentials. Billy Bragg is about to bring out a book called The Progressive Patriot, and so it's not just a question of the right winning these issues. It's also not just a question of British habits, whether it's the Sunday dinner, the holiday at the seaside. I used to go to Broadstairs every year for my holiday for 2 weeks as a kid in Kent. It's not about jelly deals and the rest of it. What it's about is something a lot more fundamental. It's even difficult in a way to talk about Britishness when you're doing a meeting like this now, because in lots of ways in this country the argument has now moved beyond Britishness to Englishness. David Cameron is trying very hard to marginalise Gordon Brown at the moment for his Scottishness. Now, I've got a lot of Gordon Brown, you know, when he's Chancellor, sticking to Tory spending plans, back in Blair's war, Trident, right, and stuff. But being Scottish isn't really the biggest problem I've got with Gordon Brown, particularly as he spends a lot of time trying to talk about Britishness himself, and also a lot of time trying to prove that he's really English, right? So as far as support for the England football team went, and I want to try and go on to what Gordon's speech at the beginning of this year, when we had a call for a day of Britishness, right? People remember he's talking about trying to turn Armistice Day into a Remembrance Sunday into a British day. And what he said was, "But think, what is our 4th of July? What is our Independence Day? Where is our Declaration of Rights? What is our equivalent of a flag in every garden?" In other words, what he's trying to look to is an American model of inclusion. But there is a little bit of a problem with using the American model. We've just seen huge demonstration of Latino workers marching through the streets in the United States of America, demanding their inclusion in a society that is rejecting them. When we saw what happens in New Orleans, we saw that literally tens of thousands, of hundreds of thousands of black working class people didn't feel that they were part of that inclusion. Well, it's just quite a little bit from Gary Young's book. He said that there were daily scenes of thousands of African Americans being told to be patient as they died, their old perishing as they festered in filthy homes. And he quoted Kanye West, who said, "I've tried turning away from the TV because it's just too hard to watch Bush doesn't care about black people. This is a society that has got citizenship ceremonies, that has got an idea of involving the whole, every element of the population in a national consensus, really, and stuff. But those people don't feel, in that circumstance, included. And sadly for Gordon, even the British Legion lined up against him when he made his speech. They were very much in favour of a Britishness Day, but didn't believe it should be carried out on Remembrance Sunday. But when Gordon Brown made his speech to the Fabian Society, he did it against the backdrop of the bombs on 7/7 and also of globalisation. He said a number of things, really. Firstly, that we have to look for balancing the need of diversity with the obvious requirements of integration, a direct statement about the Muslim community in Britain. The second thing he says, that in a global market, we need to talk about a nationally united and shared sense of purpose about the long-term sacrifices that we are all prepared to make. Now, this is a little bit of a worrying statement when you think about what they're doing to our pensions at the moment. He said that Britain that he admired was one of thousands of voluntary associations, mutual societies, craft unions, and the public services. This is the man who's been behind PFI. And what he talked about fundamentally was a British nationalism based on liberty for all and fairness to all. And what he said with that was, this is a vision that we move a long way from the old left's embarrassed avoidance of an explicit patriotism. And otherwise, it's okay to be patriotic now. And actually, one of the first people that jumped to Gordon Brown's defence was Trevor Phillips, the man who heads up the CRE, who just a couple of days afterwards argued that what Gordon was talking about was really taking back the flag from the BNP. And obviously a whole number of other British government ministers and ex-government ministers have jumped into this discussion. Most forcefully, really, was David Blunkett. David Blunkett made a speech a year or so ago to the Public Policy Research and David started off by warning us against siren voices who oppose patriotism, such as the ancient Stoics through to Karl Marx and Kant. So anybody who's read Karl Marx or Kant, throw that stuff away right now, because they are trying to throw you from the patriotic way, really. He took up an argument against who he described as extreme multiculturalists, really, and argued that patriotism was progressive and a generous force, while believing, David says, that we owe our compatriots things that we don't owe people further away from home. Right, so he went on to argue that because Tony Blair and Gordon Brown had clarity on domestic affairs, they've been able to lead on international affairs, issues such as world poverty. And what he put up as a statement of his achievements was the citizenship curriculum and the citizenship tests that people now have to take part in. He described this as a way of getting past the uncertainty that followed the end of empire. So anybody who's been feeling uncertain since the end of empire, we've now got a solution to this, because we can go forward with confidence now that Britain is again an international player. So we're all feeling okay on this one, really, right stuff. And just one little aside, if anybody's seen the citizenship test, two of the questions here are brilliant. Where are the Cockney, Geordie and Scouse dialects spoken? Right? That's one. We're normally in the same street, but anyway, right? The second one, if anybody can do this, it'll be brilliant. Put the UK Saints Days in calendar order. Right? Well, everybody can do that one, can't they? So there you go, right? And what David Blunkett comes in is to back Gordon Brown's vision of a shared national identity. And he described this as an identity of tolerance and internationalism, quite a good one. We're showing our internationalism in a minute in Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, and the rest of it, and also our commitment to democracy. And David goes on, though, to worry about one thing, and he's worried that English people are reluctant to champion their national identity. For all these years, England's always worried about championing its identity abroad. And he quotes some figures on this, but to show that improvements have been made under New Labour. In 1992, only 31% of us saw ourselves as English, but by 2003, this had risen to 40%. Right? In 2003, 36% of us saw ourselves as more English than British, and this was definitely an improvement, because in 1997, when Labour came to power, it was only 24%. See, so we have made a great deal of advance. And he goes on to celebrate the St George's flag, the St George's flag that really came to the centre ground in Euro 2000 and Euro 2004. And what he basically argues is nobody moans about St Patrick's Day, so why should anybody moan about St George's Day? And this stuff, really, what he's arguing and what he goes on to say explicitly, implicitly is the problem here is that nationalism is being left to the BNP, right, and stuff, while the left has evacuated the ground. There's one exception he argued, which was George Orwell. I want to come back to George Orwell in a minute and stuff, but there's some brilliant stuff here, right? Because to make his point about St George's Day, David talks about the things that he thinks of on St George's Day, right? First of all, the English landscape. He says the English people feel a deep attachment to our landscapes. That's true, right? Secondly, right, stuff, he talks about English poetry. Well, you can't knock him on that one, I suppose. Whatever. English music, though, and here's the best one. He describes himself as an aficionado of English folk music. It's not bad, really, for David there, really. Stuff. And also English humour. Apparently, you know, there we go again, Monty Python, the greatest thing in the world, blah, 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 really. But more seriously, he goes on to talk about an English radical tradition and how he sees that as part of the tradition we need to buy into. And he names some names, which is quite interesting, really, and stuff, because all these people would be very surprised to be named by David Blunkett, right? Tom Paine. Tom Paine was an international revolutionary at the time of the French and American Revolution. Sylvia Pankhurst, a Bolshevik, right? That's an interesting one. George Orwell, he keeps talking about him, but George Orwell did go out to Spain and fight for the POUM, a revolutionary socialist organisation, and the Match Girls. The Match Girls wouldn't necessarily be in favour of the anti-Labour laws that the New Labour have left in place over the last couple of years. But see, the point is, as Tony Blair repeatedly calls on the Muslim community to deal with terrorism, it shows that really this whole talk of British or English patriotism is simply not neutral. We have a group of people who are not seen as fitting into the national consensus, and one of these groups, only one of these groups, like I said, is the Muslim population. I want to quote from a bloke called Richard Eyre, who wrote on The Guardian online, really. He tried to use an example of what sort of trying to hit back against this idea of just a simple Englishness and stuff, and he quoted Malcolm McLaren. Right, Malcolm McLaren said that his idea of Englishness was it's about singing in karaoke bars, it's about eating Chinese noodles, it's about Japanese sushi, drinking French wine, wearing Prada and Nike, dancing to Italian house, using an Apple Mac, holidaying in Florida and Ibiza and buying a house in Spain. Now that is very multicultural, but also it's out of the price range of most people in this room, really, and stuff. But what he does go on to, he says something very good, I think. He says, my regret is solely that in a swamp of celebrity worship and marketing bullshit and the apparently helpless desire to become the 51st state of the Union, one British virtue will be overlooked: tolerance. Now, if we remember in 1997, when we had Cool Britannia and the rest of it, tolerance really was a watchword that we had Liam Gallagher going in, you know, sipping champagne, right, stuff in 10 Downing Street and the rest of it. Now we've gone from that to actually sections of the population being described as the enemy within. You see, because lots of people don't fit into Blair, Blunkett and Brown's version of a national consensus. That's not just about the Muslim population. I want to I picked up The Guardian today, but there's a really interesting article about Barking and Dagenham, where the BNP have made a breakthrough. And really what it shows is the reality of what's going on in Barking and Dagenham, really, where you've got a community that has been butchered, really, under the Tories and New Labour. Industry has been gutted in the area, really. People have very, very little. And it describes a woman, right, stuff that they don't put a second name, called Sandra, who is about to be evicted from her house. She's in a privately owned accommodation, really. And she's so worried that literally the reporter talks about her hair falling out during the discussion with her and stuff. And she's gone to see her BNP councillor, right, stuff, because she is so desperate. The BNP councillor tells her the reason she hasn't got a council house is because the immigrants are getting the council housing. It's a good thing The Guardian did, because they worked out that there are 20,250 council houses in Barking and Dagenham, and 4 of them belong to asylum seekers. Now, asylum seekers ain't really the problem there. There is a problem. New Labour don't build no council houses anymore. You need £250,000 or £1/3 to pay for a house in the southeast of England, and therefore working class people are cut out of the ability to buy a decent house and have to throw themselves into these disgusting places with rackman landlords in a way that hasn't been seen for a generation. And really, to argue as New Labour do, that the way you win the ground back from the BNP is to wave the flag, is to ignore the reason why these Labour supporting areas are now voting for the BNP, because there's no decent bloody housing, there is no decent schools, right, and stuff, there is no decent public services and stuff, and until that's tackled, right, and stuff, the BNP will make ground in these areas and stuff, really, and stuff. And actually that's another section of the community that is not part of the national consensus. When I have a little thing to go through, really, people who don't feel part of that consensus and stuff. Today it's Muslims. Actually in the 1970s, all the arguments about the way the community works, all the arguments about terrorism, all the arguments about the way people's religion work, actually take away Muslim, put in Catholic and the rest of it and stuff, was the Irish community during the 1970s. Neil Davidson wrote in Socialist Worker in August 2005, in fact, what is remarkable is that despite the way non-white immigrants to Britain have been treated, they have nevertheless demanded that they be treated as British. And see, the thing is, when people are under the cosh, their identities, their religion, become much more important to them. Multiculturalism, though, is no longer seen as a celebration of difference in this country. What is seen as a form of self-imposed social apartheid. Being prepared to express your cultural and religious identity has become a case of you segregating yourself. So it's no longer a problem about the society, it's a problem about you. It's not about 9/11, it's not about the war in Iraq, it's not about young Muslims being locked up and the rest of it. It's about you separating yourself and making ghettos for yourself. It's interesting if you think about the argument about the Muslim family, for example. A few years ago, we were being told that Afro-Caribbean families, these people, they were the criminals and they had no family values and whatever. But look at these Asian families, right? So these Asian families were so solid and so whatever. Now, this is supposed to be the breeding ground of terrorism. When Muslim communities on bulk used to vote Labour, that was okay. That was about social cohesion. Now they vote Labour. It's about the clerics swinging the Muslim community, right, stuff, community politically. Really, what we're saying here is it's not. Surely, if you talk about a multicultural society, it's not just about Robin Cook's version of a sort of chicken masala mix and all the rest of it. It's about multiculturalism. It's supposed to mean really accepting people's difference, and more than that, multiculturalism was supposed to be a way really of communities making a political claim really for resources inside society. There's about Terence Turner, an anthropologist, who argued that multiculturalism is primarily a movement of change. The trouble is, though, once these communities start arguing and fighting for resources, they can also be seen as something to hit against as well. How can a community like the Muslim community really buy in to a common value with Gordon Brown and with Tony Blair at a time when predominantly Muslim countries are being plastered by British jets and have British soldiers on the ground? How can we talk about sharing common values in that situation really? The problem is there are always outsiders in the picture of the national community that Gordon Brown and David Blunkett try to paint. And like I said, that's not just about Muslims, it's not just about the white working class, it's also about any young kid who's got a hoodie on, who stands on a street corner and stuff, and actually, he's asbowed and the rest of it. It's also about the trade unionists who are supposed to be dinosaurs, right, and stuff, and have got the lashes on Tony Blair's back and the rest of the stuff, really, because they stand up against privatisation and the rest of it. Really, what's being talked about here, in my opinion, really, is old-fashioned assimilation. In other words, immigrant communities have to fit themselves in to the society in which they live, and that's where the famous comment came from, isn't it? When people argued that they should speak English in their own homes, even if English wasn't their first language. Racism is no longer seen as the problem; it's seen the other way round. So, for example, in areas like Bradford, the problem is that Muslims want to live together. This is nothing to do with the fact that housing policy or the rest of it. It's just that people have this innate feeling that they want to live together. Ali Rantansi wrote in October 2004 in a publication called Open Democracy, attacked the idea that really what was going on was immigrants failing to assimilate into a tolerant society. And what I argued really was that, there are progressive traditions in Britain. Yeah, there are progressive ideas of anti-racism and the rest of it, but there's also the murder of Stephen Lawrence, there's also institutional racism, and there's also been a long history of bigotry against new communities that came in, alongside the tradition as well of solidarity with those communities. Just use one example. When the Jewish community settled at the turn of the century and stuff in the East End of London, really, they weren't welcomed with open arms by the establishment. There was a massive argument, exactly the same as today, that these people would not assimilate, that they would not change their habits and their ways, really. Actually, the alternative tradition to that has nearly always come from working class communities that, despite the fear of people coming in to take resources and the rest of it, because of basic class ideas of solidarity really and stuff, can support those communities. So one example, in 1936 when the Nazis marched in Cable Street to try to drive the Jews out of the East End of London, it was the establishment that had front pages on like the Daily Mail and the rest of it saying hurrah for the black shirts, where it was the outcasts in society, the communists, the trade unionists and the Irish, there were 100,000 of them who gathered and demonstrated and beat the Nazis out of the East End of London. See, there's one small factor that's being left out of the analysis of Britishness from Gordon Brown, David Blunkett and Tony Blair, really, and it's the issue of class. Right, stuff. Actually, when you look at the horrors that Gary Young describes in the United States of America, the poverty that one section of society feels, the question of class, it can be brought up exactly into the dialogue about British history. I want to use the example really of the Second World War, because for anybody, the Second World War really is the defining moment really of British identity. That's the moment, the Spitfire summer, that's the moment when we stood up against fascism and the rest of it. There are little examples that don't get brought up in that sort of picture of a national unity. You know, when the Queen Mother went down to the East End of London, she wasn't embraced by everybody when they were being bombed. She was booed. When Winston Churchill turned around and said, "We can take it," they had bricks thrown at him by people in the East End because they couldn't take it, because they were losing their houses. You know, Buckingham Palace was bombed during the war, but it wasn't blitzed in the way the East End of London was. The Communist Party in the 1940s had to occupy the London Underground to give people shelters, because working class people weren't seen as worthy of having shelters because they cost too much money. Actually, the Ritz, the Communist Party occupied the Ritz during the Blitz because the diners used to sit there with a very expensive dinner, and if the bombing started, they would just go downstairs to the deep shelter and stuff where everybody else was being blown to shit in the East End of London. So actually these examples, you know, all the ones we've just been through, the stuff, the 90th anniversary of the Somme and the Battle of Britain and all the rest of it, have been, the way you looked at them at the time depended really in the money in your pocket. In other words, it was a matter. In other words, it was a matter of class. And when David Blunkett takes up the argument of radical individuals inside British history, people like the Tolpuddle martyrs or the suffragettes or George Orwell and people really and stuff. He's not talking about some eccentric British tradition. He's talking about a tradition that is separate from the whole British tradition. I want to use one example particularly as well about George Orwell, because they keep using George Orwell and saying he's, you know, the example of how you can be a patriot and how you can be a patriot and how you can be on the left at the same time. It's true that George Orwell did try to find, in sorts of ways, a sort of radical fusion between, a sort of synthesis between nationalism and socialism and stuff. Actually, it's because of particular times as well, what was going on in the Second World War, the radicalisation of British society and the rest of it. But I just want to give you a quote from George Orwell. He wrote this after Dunkirk, after Britain's, you know, that great glorious moment where we scuttled across the Channel during the Second World War. What Orwell wrote was that the defeat in Flanders will turn out to be one of the great turning points in English history. In that spectacular disaster, the working class, the middle class, and even a section of the business class could see the utter rottenness of private capitalism. For the first time in their lives, the comfortable, the professional optimists had to admit there was something wrong. Now, this might be a kind of nationalism, but it's a very different kind of nationalism, really, and stuff from the stuff that comes out from Gordon Brown, Blair, or any of the rest of them. See, really, what we're being asked to buy into is a Britishness that is now being repackaged as one of liberty and tolerance. And this is a development. If you remember John Major's brand of nationalism, it literally was, he talked about, you know, the sound of leather on willow on the village green and the rest of it. And actually most people would just laugh at that and stuff, but they're not trying to sell this to us anymore, really. The trouble is, maybe in 1997, maybe on that glorious morning when we all woke up and the Tories had been thrown out and stuff, actually this stuff could be sold to you. The idea that perhaps there was a possibility of a national community and the rest of it. The problem is, we're talking about 9 years down the line now. We're talking about after the two wars. We're talking about what's happened to the Muslim community, what's happened to working class communities, what's happened to trade unions and the rest of it. It's much more difficult for anybody to buy into that version of patriotism. See, what I'm trying to say really is that every positive part of the Britishness that they are describing, right, and stuff they're trying to sell to us really comes from a completely different tradition than the English or British national tradition. You know, the thing they love about London, they always go on about the vibrancy of cities like London and Glasgow and Manchester and other places and stuff, of different communities, different religions, different ways of looking at things, right? You can't celebrate that while at the same time attacking communities that are part of that. Actually, you know, in London at the moment, really, and stuff, you know, the East End of London, it might be nice to talk to people about going down to Brick Lane and the rest of it, but there's also an argument and stuff that half these people are supposedly terrorists. You can't put this argument up, this argument up in this way, really. And like I said, really, you know, the fact that people like Tom Paine, you know, people like Sylvia Pankhurst are being mentioned by the likes of David Blunkett. I mean, apart from the fact that they will be spinning in their graves, really, literally, and stuff under this thing, but they have not only a separate tradition, but a tradition that has tried to overthrow Britain, that has tried to overthrow the way Britain is set up and stuff, and the kind of class basis that Britain has been set up. In other words, it's a million miles between, you know, these people might have been born in this country, but as far as their Englishness or their Britishness goes, this is a very, very separate thing. So the last thing really I want to say is this, really, is if you did support England during the World Cup, apart from the fact that you had a very bad World Cup, really, and stuff. I don't personally believe you should be thrown from the third floor window. I don't necessarily believe that this means you are lost to the cause of socialism. Some people might, but I don't really. I think that's the first thing to say, really. And I think also, really, that, you know, anybody else, I think if anybody wants to really annoy people anyway, do what I did and support Germany, right? So if it really does annoy people, I would say that, really, and stuff. So, but anyway. But second thing to say, really, but as far as a common Britishness goes, really, a common Britishness depends quite simply on whether you are lucky enough to be allowed into Blair and Brown's national consensus. And unluckily, or luckily, sadly, most of us aren't. We're not allowed into that national consensus, really. What we are is stuck with the old, evil, terrible, old left values of multiculturalism and internationalism. And the one thing to celebrate about that, particularly I think myself, is you don't have to sing the worst fucking national anthem in the whole world, God Save the Queen.
Right, okay, if people want to make contributions or ask questions, if they raise their hands and then come up to the microphone to do it. If you try and keep them short, and I'll tap on the microphone when you've got a minute left.
I'm always short. My daughter said to me the other day, my 8-year-old, she said, Mummy, if Blair wasn't a really nasty Prime Minister who didn't start wars all over the world, would you support England then? So I said, no, I wouldn't. But because I don't support them in wars, and that's why I don't support them in football team. But it's quite a hard argument to have with an 8-year-old, and we agreed to differ on it. No, the reason I want to speak is actually because I'm from a place called Beeston. You may have heard of it. It's actually not in Nottingham, it's in Leeds. And, well, it's been in the press over and over again over the last year and a bit. What has made me very proud, actually, to say I'm not proud to be British, but I'm actually very, very proud to be from Beeston. Because given we had everybody in the world with their camera and their, their full Monty, I keep seeing vans now and expecting them to have these satellite dishes on the top, because that's what it's been like. We had there was a choice really that people made. Now, people who don't know the history of Beeston, there is actually two sides of Beeston. There's Beeston Hill, which is the poorer end on the other side of the park, which is where the suspects lived, etc. And there's the top end of Beeston, which is slightly richer. Tubman's looking down Tubman's head or whatever. It means he's got one car instead of, you know what I mean. And it's just not rich at any part of Beeston. But there was always this position that there was Beeston and Beeston Hill. And a lot of the old white Labour Party people talk about Beeston Hill, that's the other side of the park, etc. Beeston, this is real Beeston. Well, when the press came to Beeston, they didn't go on Beeston Hill, not Beeston. Actually, they came to Beeston. And those people for years and years and years who talked about the other side of the park, like we talk about the north-south divide, the other side of the park, walked across the park, some of them very, very old, walked across the park and stood outside the Hamara Centre to join the 3-minute silence. So there was hundreds and hundreds of people. My friend, mum and dad, thought they'd be the only white people there, and they looked around and everybody was there. And that's been the thing that's gone on, actually. It's that thing about, providing people with an opportunity to stand together. And standing together is very, very important. We had a number, this was a full hour's meeting, but a number of examples. The Thursday I was invited to the mosque with all the elders, and I'm going, but you have to mention the war, you have to talk about the war. And our Labour MP from Dewsbury's going, no, don't mention the war yet. And then, there was an argument there yesterday when we had a peace treaty, which some of you may have seen, which was hijacked. We have to be about the great and the good, but they did say generally the right things about peace and, they didn't mention peace, unity they talked about, we mentioned peace. But when, the actual visions of the kids planting the tree, that was a good. And actually what was good about that yesterday is we were talking to everybody, and everybody was talking to each other about how we're going to reopen the local sports centre that they've closed in the last 6 months. It's that sort of thing that talk about being proud, not to be British, but to be proud of a member of the Beeston community.
Can the gentleman at the back want to come up first? And then Despina, want to come and get ready? Gentleman at the back next. Sorry.
That's what confused me. You clearly don't know me very well. I've forgotten what I was going to say now. You put me entirely off. I think the point I wanted to make, Mike made a very interesting point about the argument is sometimes put, well, there's St. Patrick's Day, therefore we should have St. George's Day. And it's often put in a very, very right-wing way. Of course, the point about St. Patrick's Day is basically a marketing exercise for Diageo, who make Guinness. And I think the one St. George's Day celebrations basically do the same for another brewery. But there's also tends to be a left-wing version of the argument for British identity, which is that, well, the reason there's racism is because people are insecure about their British identity, and maybe if they had an English identity, they'd be more accepting of other identities, in the same way as the Irish or the Scottish are, which clearly can only be put by someone who's never been to Ireland and Scotland, which are countries where, to be honest, levels of racism are higher by far than I think in England, and that's because of the anti-racist fight back here. I know it's a cliche to say that the profession of patriotism is the last refuge of scoundrels, but it's because Blair and Brown are scoundrels that they're professing patriotism.
I'm not British anyway. I'm going to say, because there is an attack on multiculturalism from the government, they start coming on the side some arguments on racism. And I want to explain what happened at University of East London, where I'm doing a part-time course. We have an AGA meeting and appear a motion this year that they demand to campaign for more British food in the canteen of potatoes, roast potatoes and beef. And we have to have an argument, and it was really, people thought it was silly, but I thought it was serious, because we can leave them to go with all of these arguments, basically. And I have to say, basically, I don't think there is a British food, even though the fish and chips, what they say it's a British food, it's a merge of different culture in 1890s in East London, from Irish potatoes and fish where Jewish people cook, and it came together in fish and chips. Anyway, the most favorite food in this country is chicken tikka, yeah. But I thought, what do you mean by Britishness? Do you mean basically the 2 million people who marched against the war, or a minority people who took us in the war? Do you mean 95% of the people who are against of privatization and back in, to renationalize the railway, or a very small minority who take, and privatize our services? And the other thing is, the real problem in the colleges, as James Oliver saw, is the lack of different food, good food, in a very small prices. Because, even though in the universities they start privatize, and coming in canteens, corporations take the canteens, and basically exploit workers, for less than the minimum wages, for shit food where everybody to sit. And I think it's important, because the argument's coming all the way, to be able to respond, not to leave things like that to go.
Yeah, I want to make 3 quick points. Firstly, E.P. Thompson, in his book, The Invention of Tradition, I think it's very important here. Up until 1750, people didn't identify with being English, British, or whatever. They didn't know where these places were. Daniel Defoe, on a tour of England in 1750, asked people, 2 miles from Wakefield, where is Wakefield? They didn't know where it was. This is a creation of capitalism over the last 100, 150 years. This identification with a certain bit of ground you call Britain, England, Scotland, or whatever. I think that's very important to establish that. The second point I want to make is really about asylum seekers. I also come from Beeston. And one of the big changes that's happened in Beeston in the last few years is the number of asylum seekers. It has transformed the place into an international community that covers the entire globe. And so when you get the Sunday Times last week saying it's an insular society, it's a society where this undercover reporter spent 12 weeks there and never spoke to a white person, it is just a disgraceful comment to make. It's also a society where last weekend there was a big Muslim wedding in Beeston, and about 4 o'clock, about 100 of the guests were desperate to go and watch the football match, and they all slided off. And that wasn't a picture that was put on the newspapers at all. The final thing I want to say is about football. And there was a little article about the Muslim players at the World Cup. Very interesting that Zidane, Ribery, and Van Persie, all Muslims. So I've got a solution to the England football team problem. And that is only train and recruit Muslim players from this country. It would be fantastic, and it would undermine massively all this semi-quasi-patriotism, racist bollocks that go alongside the football.
Yeah, I just want to talk a bit about citizenship and talk a bit about what Michael said about how the government are trying to bring in citizenship to make model people as citizens in the country. And the idea behind it is we can reclaim idea of Britishness. And when you open up a textbook, year 10s, you get the first lesson is British identity. And there's a picture of someone Morris dancing. There's a picture of sheep in a field. And even like the British kids in the class, working class kids, are like, what is going on? What is that man dressed like? What is happening here? Not one kid in that class understood what Morris dancing was, or had never, most of them hadn't seen sheep in a field, because they're working class kids and they're living in Islington in a really underdeprived area. And it wouldn't matter to Blair if they were, as British as they come. He would still be ignoring them. They'd be still in a school where in Islington they're trying to divide kids on class. They're going to set up an academy where the kids of middle-class parents will go to and get a great education. And the kids who go to my school, which incidentally used to be called George Orwell's school, so, we've got George there, great George Orwell tradition. That's not going to help us when they turn our school into a vocational school. They're going to bring in building schools for the future, computers in every classroom. You have to have computers whether you like it or not. You have to stop teaching from books. We're not allowed to have books. We've got to have computers. We're going to sit there like some automaton. The kids are going to lock into these computers. They're going to get trained up for the call centres of the future. So, this idea that because you're British or you're not British matters anything to Blair. It doesn't matter anything. If you're living in Islington and you're a working class person, you're going to end up with a school where you don't get a proper education. We did the Britishness lesson. It was great. Up on the board, brainstorm, go and find out your family trees. Come back next week and tell me where the origins are. 24 kids in the class, 18 different places of origin, okay? One kid said they were British, then it found out he had a grandfather who was Turkish anyway, okay? So there were, this idea that there's a Britishness to reclaim. Kids see themselves as British. You hear them talking, Cockney accents, one and all, but parents or grandparents come from all over the world. They understand multiculturalism. They celebrate each other's differences. They sit in a classroom every day, and they understand that. But the parents are seen as something to be dismissed, whether they're British, whether they're multicultural, whatever it is. Man came to talk about building schools for the future. We're not having any of those things, parent meetings. Oh no, we'll have little conferences where they can come individually and talk to the head teacher about what they feel about building schools for the future, about the fact their kids are not going to get an education. It doesn't matter to them whether they're British or not. They don't want parents joining together to fight for a working class future. It doesn't matter to them where you come from. We don't want you in our school getting together. Class to them, they don't understand it. They understand working class parents get in the room are going to kick their ass and they're not going to have computers in every classroom and leading to vocational schools. But at the end of the day, we can celebrate multiculturalism because we are in a school where Islington is like, mixed race, one of the most mixed race places in Earth. And they can't hold it back. They can try and teach citizenship, but it's too late. Multiculturalism is here to stay, whether they like it or not.
I wanted to say that these ideas, this kind of idea that there's this Englishness and whatever that they're trying to bring in is constantly contested. It's never a fixed state that you can kind of arrive at, and I think it's really important we remember that. One of the questions that came up in the multiculturalism thing was about solidarity, and I think that's something that's actually forged as people try and defend their swimming pool or whatever it is. These things are practically formed, which is why I think what we're all trying to do is being activists, and that is so important. And I think it's one of the ways that they try and sell us what it is they're trying to do. They try constantly to use nationalism to get us to accept. If you can wave an England flag, maybe you'll accept the war. If you will blame the person who's supposedly taken your council house, presumably, then you won't blame the government, which after 9 years has no answers at all to people, and therefore, it's easier in a way to get us to turn around. And I think actually what Margaret Hodge said in Barking was disgusting, because if she didn't only let the BNP in, which is a horrible and dreadful thing to do, she kind of, in a way, by characterising all the white working class people as racist, she was having a go at them as well and say, it's their fault, because they're racist, so that's what the problem is. And I mean, just talking about this thing of hegemony, that thing about we, who is we? Who is we? Because you ask people who live in London, and they will say, I feel that when you live in a place where lots of people can be themselves, in other words, where you have tolerance, then you can be yourself too, even if you are white. Because other people can be themselves, it's not like it's a big threat. And I know there are people who feel threatened by that and some of their identity is slipping away, but I think as soon as you start living in a place where there are lots of different sort of practices, and you meet people, and it's, that's the sort of way that people begin to feel they can be themselves. And I just wanted to, like Anne Cryer, this question of we, after the Bradford riots, this is what she said. Some leaders pretend it is just as bad in the white community, she's talking about violence, but we do not have this degree of killing in violence in the white community. Who is this we? Do you know what I mean? Because I feel like that she's not talking about, when she talks, she's trying to embrace the majority to get them on their side. And to be honest, I don't identify with that at all.
Sorry to bring it back down to the level of the World Cup again, Michael. I know you tried to raise it a bit. But in my school, it's a complete white school. It's in the countryside outside of Durham. And during the the World Cup's just dominated. The World Cup has just dominated everything that has happened over the last, since it started, what was it, a month now or something. Anyway, the kids were all really excited, all about the England stuff, and, oh, who's your favourite player, miss? I said, I don't support England. And it's like, what? And I had a big gang all around me. I said, well, I support Argentina. And it's like, oh, glory seeker, glory seeker. And I got these from every class that came in. And I said, well, if you'd like to hear my reasons why I'm not supporting England, I'll tell you. And then there was this big whoosh. So I just said, well, first of all, and this is when they were playing, was it Paraguay? So they were Paraguay. I said, that nation, a third of the nation, earns less than £1 a day. And that's what they have to live off. Said, what makes me feel so bloody good about supporting 9 or 11 English players who I've got absolutely no identity with, who would, like, on how much money, said, name how much David Beckham earns, I haven't got a clue. Said, but they're worth millions. I said, and they're supposed to be proud to play these people here. So, oh, right. And they understood it, and they were brilliant on it. And I said, now let's go on to Trinidad and Tobago. I said, what do you know about the Caribbean, the history and so on? And they knew about slavery. I said, so when the English fans stand up and sing, is it land of hope and glory, England will never, never, never be enslaved. They sang that to those people whose tradition, whose history was enslaved by Britain for years and years and years. And then you could see them thinking like, oh, yeah, that's a point as well, miss. So anyway, we moved on. I said, well, I haven't got anything proud of you about British. We had all the arguments about fish and chips and so on, and all that lot went into it. But I said, well, I'm married to an Albanian. I said, I've got mixed race nieces and nephews who are like half Chinese. So my parents are Scottish. So I've got absolutely no identity whatsoever with any of this. And I said, and just remember the lesson that we had last week, and we'd had a lesson on citizenship where actually the lesson was rubbish that was given to us to deliver, was on human rights, and it was, pap. So I said, let's do about Soweto, because it was the anniversary of Soweto. And they had a really great discussion about the kids in Soweto standing up for themselves. And there's a ban of hoodies in our school at the moment. And I said, haven't you got more in common with those kids in Soweto than you have with any of this? And they were like, absolutely, because they could see. And I think all this nationalism is just whipped up, just serves for one purpose only, and it just blurs the boundaries. For the last World Cup, our head teacher, he actually organised a big film screening, and like all the teachers, the film teachers were coming in wearing with their nails painted with the little red crosses on. And it's like, what happened to us calling him Barry Brittas? We used to call the head Barry Brittas. And then it's like, oh, he's great because he's organised this. It blurs the boundaries, and that's why we have to always put an argument for, not nation, but class.
My parents came from abroad, and they would actually want the British flag put up everywhere. So I think that Britishness, whether it exists or not, it's about whether it's in people's minds. I've talked to a lot of people that have come from abroad, and they're quite shocked about how undemocratic Britain is and how nasty it can be. And because I was born here, I just sort of know that anyway, and I just always seem a bit shocked at why they thought it was going to be any better. So I'm trying to understand that. But the worst thing for a long time that I've heard is from Tony Blair is this thing about false grievances about the Palestinians, Iraq and Afghanistan. I just think that is the sickest thing. I don't know. And I don't know whether I can just put it down as racism. It just seems to be like Michael was saying about the Irish. It's a denial of any complaint. So you can do whatever you want to someone that makes a complaint. and it does try to stop people making those complaints anyway. So once there's no complaints, then you can even hammer these people more. So I find it very dangerous.
Okay, can we have the chap at the back and then the chap in the middle?
I wanted to just comment on the whole background to this. Well, one of the things that I think is the background to this, which is the decline of the British Empire, and now there's a section of the British ruling class who want to revive the idea of empire. I'm a history teacher, and I follow what goes on in the history national curriculum, and if you look, they've just revised it. I've just got this yesterday, the new revised national curriculum, and what it says is there's been a long argument by Prince Charles and all sorts of cronies about how we've got to teach about the British Empire. And it says, funnily enough, it's here in the new national curriculum for history. We're going to teach about the nature of empires, including the British Empire and its impact on different people. And actually, they haven't got away with what they wanted, because what these people have been arguing for so long is that we've got to teach how the empire was a force for good in the world. And and when you've listened to Blair and Blunkett and all these people, they've been trying to bang this on for so long, and yet they still can't get away with it. And I was struck, I've been this morning up to the Islam Expo, where I was speaking on a debate about faith schools, but I was making the point about what sort of history should we get in our schools, and I was making an argument for that there should actually be some sort of Islamic history. If there's Black History Month, why not have an Islamic History Month? Which went down relatively well, except with some of the more extreme Muslim schools people who don't want any sort of Muslim education in the mainstream. But the point and someone mentioned this, Blair and Blunkett and Prince Charles, there's a whole stream of them over the last decade, have been banging on this. It is a sense of their own desperation. When Blair said last week that the young Muslim youth have a completely false sense of grievance, it's an outrageous claim. Does he not want to look at the maps? I know Michael's doing a meeting on what a carve up. Do you want to look at the maps of the world and see how it's carved up? And it's this sense of falseness, which means that they're clinging to this notion of Britishness, and it's a completely absurd position. But they are going to try through the schools to put this in to our curriculum, so we need to be wary of it, because some teachers will misinterpret. We can teach about the British Empire. Just want the last thing, it's the empire on which the sun never set, but it's also the empire on which the blood never run dry. So.
Can you all hear me, yeah? Yeah, sorry, I'm going to drag it down to the level of football again. Very important. I think actually people remember Norman Tebbett's cricket test, and actually I think that's been supplanted by the World Cup football test. And it's like funny for me when I was growing up in Hackney, in East London, near the Tower Hamlets border. World Cup times was actually a time of real horror. I remember particularly in 1990 when England played Cameroon in the semi-final. I remember actually black people being spat at in the street. I remember Somalians being beaten up, and I remember it had been a really, really, really horrible time. And people have talked about how things have changed since then and how it's cool, and lots of multiculturalism means that lots of ethnic minorities are supporting England. And it's quite funny because when England lost to Portugal, I sort of cock-a-hoop ran out of my house, and well, this will tell you a lot about me, because the first place I went was to the pan shop to get some Rizzlers. Right, the first person I saw in there was a Muslim woman in a burqa who had a daughter in an England T-shirt, and she said to her daughter, they looked crestfallen, and she said to her daughter, "Oh, do you want to get another England flag?" And I was like, oh my god. So then I went to the Turkish shop next door to get some wine, and I spoke to the guy there, and I said to him, "What is it?" I said to him, "I'm really happy that England have lost, right? And what is it with all the other shopkeepers around there with their England fans? And we have predominantly Turkish and Asian and black shopkeepers on our street." And he said, "The truth of the matter is, people are so scared that if they're not seen to be supporting Britain, particularly the people in the kebab shop, that they get all the drunken lads hurling abuse at them." And I think that's a really important thing that we need to remember, that actually the climate affair at the moment has created such a fear that actually Muslim people feel that they have to show off their Britishness more than the English do in order to be accepted into society. I think there's also a counter argument where actually some media-friendly people that said, actually, oh, was it great that we're so emotionally diverse? And I remember buying the Independent newspaper on a Saturday, and it had a picture where it said England expects, and it had every 32 different nations, and they were like, it was a good newspaper, you know, I mean, good front page, black, Iranian, and they all lived in London and stuff, right? What it said, though, it had it even had one of their employees, but my partner who works in the paper said, well, actually, the Independent's got very few black people working there for it, right? And she said that the person they actually used there was the woman from the canteen, you know what I mean? They were the only employee. So that shows you that actually we might be still looking at multiculturalism, but it's still black people and Asian people who are doing the crap jobs in society. And the last point I want to end with, actually, people talk about the French World Cup team and about how it's a wonderful advert for anti-racism. You know, it's great that they've got Muslim players in the team, but I think we should remember that only a few months ago, those working class Muslims in Paris were actually rioting with the police because of the poor, crampy, squalid conditions that they live in. And actually, the key divide in society is class and not nationalism.
I suppose this point's going to be a bit fluffier. I live in Sheffield, in the north part of Sheffield, inner city Sheffield. A very mixed community. A lot of asylum seekers and so on: Somali, Ethiopian, Bosnian, Yemeni, Kashmiri, Pakistani, Irish, Afro-Caribbean, West African, Polish. And that's only the ones that I can think of off the top. Every year for the last 15 years, we've been having a multicultural festival at about this time. In fact, this year's multicultural festival is on Sunday. Which is why my partner can't be here because she's working. Last year it was 4 days after 7/7, and lo and behold, half an hour into the festival, 2 phone calls come in. There's a bomb. Fine, there's a bomb. So the whole park gets evacuated. One of the most brilliant things that happens in a very deprived community once a year. Off. The festival always finishes at 6 o'clock, so the local community can get back together and kind of calm down, and the park can reopen. The police reopen the park at precisely 6 o'clock. Now, is this somebody making business because they don't think that maybe Muslims should be mixing with others, or is it racist? Well, the fact the cops opened it back at 6 o'clock exactly leads me to the latter conclusion. The point is that Blair and so on hate the idea of that kind of multicultural interaction, the idea of young men and young women dancing together irrespective of race or religion or culture or whatever, and they will do their best to damage it. Now, I'm hoping that it goes off well on Sunday, but I'm keeping my fingers crossed, let's put it that way. It's a great event. It gives us a chance to talk to the local community. There will be respect stalls, there'll be socialist worker stalls, there'll be love music, hate racism stalls and so on. That's probably why they hate it.
My name is Alma Mittal. I'm working at My name is Alma Mittal. I'm working at British Refugee Council of Birmingham. I just wanted to point out certain things about refugees and asylum seekers. To say that a lot of talks about refugees and asylum seekers is nonsense. People don't talk about the truth concerning refugees and asylum seekers. That's the one thing. Unfortunately, that's not the issue of this debate today, but I will stress out certain things relating to that issue. People, they don't ask definitely why those people are here in UK and why they call them failed asylum seekers. It's because of a lot of policies, the government policies. And I will stress out also something. I will quote Robert Winder, who said that if a monument were to be erected for the victim of racial hatred, it would require a space for an awful lot of names. And definitely several millions of Britons live abroad, but nobody asks why they have, if they have the right to live abroad or not. The high risk of overstay visa in Australia are British. That's the same also in America. In the country where I'm from, a lot of British people are living there in peace. Some of them, they got married with my fellow sisters. Some of them got married with my fellow brothers. Nobody bothered them. Nothing happened to them. They are living in peace. But when people got problem and came to UK, a lot of things happened to them. It's what I call out of the frying pan into the fire. Because people, they don't know really the real story behind asylum seekers and refugees. I'm an exiled journalist. I had a problem with my country, with my government, and I had to flee to come to UK. But it was, like I said, out of the frying pan into the fire. There's a lot of things happens in UK regarding to immigrants and asylum seekers. Immigration has given many institutions in UK, like Rothschilds, Wardbrook, Barings, Reuters, and Casanova in the city, Mark and Spencer, and Dolan and Ratson in the street, Trust House, Forte, and Tesco in the Ring Road. All are the immigrant descent. We have our contribution to make. Let's live in peace. Let's forget about stereotypes. Let's be together to develop this nation and to develop all the world. Thank you very much.
First of all, just want to make a couple of points. The very first point is about immigrants, of course. Anybody who lives in England has an immigrant in their family tree. So, in reality, everybody here is based on immigration itself. And we can't hide that. No matter who you're from, where you're from, there is an immigrant in your family. And that's what, to my mind, is part of being British. The second point is I teach citizenship as a discrete subject. And of all the subjects that can be taught in school, the one with the least control from the government is actually citizenship. Yesterday we were talking with my Year 11 girls about the 2-minute silence for what happened last year in July. And the kids wanted to know why I didn't believe in the 2-minute silence. And I just pointed out to them that we have a 2-minute silence in November for 20 million people. Why we're having a 2-minute silence for 60 people. And then we went on to talking about the thousands of people who are dying every day around the world, yet the government doesn't care, doesn't have a 2-minute silence. And the girls themselves decided from that point onwards that they wanted to celebrate World Peace Day on the 21st September as a way of showing people that in reality they're just not interested in what happens in England. It's what happens around the world. So citizenship is not a subject that the government can control because it's so vast. All the teachers, and of my PGC course, 3 of us teach citizenship full time, and all 3 of us are socialists. So that tells you just what a power that can be for the kids.
On the way here today, I travelled on a very packed bus, and it didn't take me long before I worked out that it was full of French students. And they were quite happy because they started to sing football songs and things like that. And I was on the ground floor, and upstairs I could hear a lot of noise going on, and most of the songs would come from upstairs. And eventually they got round to singing the French national anthem, which to me has always been quite an interesting one. And to me it's always the symbol of the French national anthem. The thing that I associate with it most is a scene in the film Casablanca, where Casablanca is meant to be a neutral territory in the Second World War, and you've got the French, Germans and so on all there in a bar, in Rick's bar, of course, and as a scene of absolute defiance, the French sing absolutely passionately their national anthem, and it's a show of defiance to the Nazis at the time. And so, to me, that I sat there quite happy listening to this. I wonder if a French comrade would say if they'd felt the same way. But when they got off the bus, actually, it was just a kind of party atmosphere, and I can't imagine British people doing the same thing. It's something that really worries me, because when you go on holiday, most of us might go abroad this year, and you see lots of people wearing England football shirts and things like that, and it does worry me actually that the British people, there's a real aggressiveness to their nationalism. It's not something that I sense from other people. I don't see German people wearing German football shirts when I go to places abroad and things like that. I just wondered if Michael could comment on that. What is it about the British sense of their nationality that actually comes across in an aggressive way? I would say there's one thing that it relates to football, I think, is actually many people, and I certainly know people, I work in a primary school, there's a parent I can think of who I would describe as a real bonehead. For him, the most important thing in his life is England's progress in the World Cup. It's pretty sad, it's pretty pathetic. He's unemployed, he's obviously lives on a rundown council estate and everything else. But really that exists for French people also. Why is there this aggressiveness involved with British nationalism?
what I want to start off with is about being British. Is that when I was growing up, I remember that when people talked about being British, they talked about something called the British disease, right? And the British disease was that there was always strikes in Britain in the 1970s, right? And the reason why I start with that is because I think what's happening now is there's a battle about what it actually means to be British. Now, given another example is that during the Second World War, they did a survey called the British Observation Survey. It was the early surveys that they did. And they went round, and what they were trying to do was build a kind of consciousness where everybody felt that they were together. And what happened was when they went round, they found out that nobody accepted their propaganda. And the reason why they found out that nobody accepted their propaganda was because they didn't understand what they were talking about. Because they were talking about rugby, they were talking about their kind of almost like a public school mentality. And actually one of the things I think is there's not automatic truth that everybody supports this stuff when they pushed it. I have to bring it down to work up again. I just want to say one thing. One of the things the BBC put out this year was that people have got the interactive choice to switch away from a man called Motson. Right? Because if you listen to Motson about the World Cup, it was always about the World War, now we're fighting the plucky things, whatever it is. People switched over to Radio 5 because they were Australian or they were from New Zealand, the people. That means there's a tension all the time. It means people don't actually like it. It's not automatic. This is a contested territory about whether they're going to be able to get away with the whole direction that they're going in. I also think that, if you look at actually Britain, actually, in terms of a class tradition, in terms of what what we should fight for, I mean, they never mention Oliver Cromwell. Whenever you actually, I remember I've been asked to come in on citizenship to discuss it, and they say, who's your favourite British person? I go, Oliver Cromwell, because he chopped off King Charles I's head, right? That is not what they mean by British citizenship. And I think the question of fighting for a tradition that brings up class and brings up internationalism, that brings up those kind of things, is going to be the future of the battle over multiculturalism. Because the one thing that's come out that Trevor Phillips on his report on multiculturalism is that people don't accept the new idea that he's putting out. There's been a partial retreat. I'm not saying that they've won, but the CRE had to partially retreat from that. I actually think that's because in most of our cities they are multicultural by fact. And actually what they're trying to do is push inside a division. So I think that we're involved in a battle. It's a battle that we can win, but we're in the opening parts of it.
Okay, we've got time for a couple more. I saw that lady over there put her hand up.
I just want to tell you a short pro-football story, which is easy for me because my country, Austria, did not take part, which I'm very glad about. But maybe you know that 2 weeks ago we had a visit of Mr. George Bush in Vienna, which was very great. And I took a lot of pictures, of course, but my favorite picture was when I saw two boys. The one was an American, and he wore a T-shirt, I don't want to be an American idiot. Maybe you know the song from Green Day. And the other one, Iranian boy, wore an Iranian football shirt. And they were standing beside the demonstration, and both of them had a football sticker collecting book. I think you know that. And they were standing beside the demonstration and just were interested in each other's football stickers, and not that the one was wearing an American T-shirt and the other was wearing an Iranian T-shirt. And that was my favorite picture of the whole demonstration. So I think football can also bring the people together, because these two boys showed that they were not interested in their nationality. They were just interested in the same interest. And you can see it as, they were not old enough to be working class, but they have another interest, and this was football. But for me, it's a nice example.
Chap in the middle was next.
Hi. I don't know, with my accent, you'll probably tell I'm not from London. But I haven't heard a Scots accent up here yet. So I thought this debate on Britishness or Englishness was worth a few words. And I think that nationalism is something that we get played slightly differently in Scotland. It's about Scottish nationalism rather than British stuff, you know. And it's all this, what is Scotland, you know. It's about kilts, you know, which are invented by Poles for the Victorians, you know. It's I'm not sure what the hell else it's about, you know. We don't like to talk about things like empire because that was those English folk, although, you know, most of the soldiers were Scottish and most of the leaders, you know, but these are the kind of things that don't get talked about. But talk about Scottishness, I'd like to think about giving you some of our kind of delicacies, things like the deep-fried Mars bar, you know, the heart disease capital of Europe, you know. But I think a story from Scotland that I found really heartening, and it's not really from Scotland, because it's like we'll talk about Beeston, it's a community story, and it's about the Shetlands that people will know about this week. You know, where there was an attempt to, under these new rules for deporting overseas criminals, you know, we had a 21-year-old guy who's lived in 23-year-old guy who's lived in Shetland since he was 10. You know, who a few years ago had a wee drunken bout and set fire to a dustbin. What a heinous crime. And under all this shit about, you know, deporting all these criminals who, from abroad, who are still living here, was going to be deported, you know, for setting fire to a dustbin and a drunken kind of... Well, I don't care what the hell he set fire to. And I think the most amazing thing is his community didn't either. And we're talking in Shetland, you know, 2/3 of the people in Shetland signed the petition for him to stay. 2/3. 200 people at a meeting wishing him well before he went to court yesterday. And something like, you know, 2/3 of the Shetland population would be equivalent to, I mean, I don't know, to over 40 million people in Britain signing that petition. And the one thing, why they try and use nationalism in Scotland and down here, the one thing is it's a diversion, isn't it? It's a ruling class diversion from working class issues and class communities. Because what they're shit scared of is communities like Beeston and Shetland coming together to protect, you know, one of their own. You know, and I think when we talk about flags and all the rest of it, you know, my flag's always been red. It's always been international, and the Scots or the people in the UK, the rest of the UK that I've always, you know, seen as heroes haven't been the traditional kind of type. And I suppose it's a thing to end on a football story. One of the reasons I justify for supporting Scotland is because we're crap. But I supported Trinidad and Tobago because we were able to support Scotland at the World Cup, Jason Scotland. So that was our way around it.
Right, we've run out of time for questions and contributions, so I'm sorry if everybody was putting up their hands towards the end who didn't get to speak. I'm now going to pass it back to Michael to address things that came up.
Okay, well, a few things really. I mean, the first thing on the football, right? So the first thing on the football, I suppose to say, is one of the best methods of undermining English nationalism was the performance of the England team during the World Cup. And actually over the summer, right, British sport really has attempted to keep this tradition up. So you can go through the cricket where they got annihilated by Sri Lanka, and even the tennis, right, and stuff. I mean, the New Hope, it was Scottish, actually managed to fit into a particularly English pattern of playing and got annihilated, right? So I suppose there's one thing about it. A couple of these questions that came up. I suppose Regan spoke to stuff before. I suppose sort of violence associated with British nationalism and stuff in a lot of ways. If you buy, we've got to think of the whole thing around football and the kind of national culture and the rest of it. If you buy into it, quite a lot of the time from the working class, it's because you are desperate. I mean, that's the truth of it and stuff. In some ways, it becomes, you know, these days and stuff, lots of us don't go in white working class communities, don't follow off to church, right, and stuff, but also they can have other ways out of this. Sometimes it's going down to the, you know, the shopping centres and stuff to spend your Sundays, and other times it's the World Cup. And actually, the World Cup, in lots of ways, is a double-edged thing. I think there's some parts of it you do think a great thing. You have people celebrating. You know, people seeing the Coca-Cola advert and stuff where the chicken that is about to have his head cut off by the cook ends up embracing because somebody scores and this sort of thing. Like the other side of it, it is a sort sort of desperate thing that, you know, life is so miserable and so boring. This one exciting thing turns up every 4 years and stuff. And I suppose the bit that's linked into that with the whole thing about Englishness and Britishness really and stuff is that we have also got a pretty blood-soaked tradition with one element of people that comes out during that and stuff. And particularly, you know, I think it's a miracle in lots of ways and stuff that in Germany there weren't as many clashes as there were, because actually you think about how they do try and whip it up and all the stuff in the Mirror in the Sun about, you know, for you the World Cup is over and all this sort of stuff where the press and the media and politicians try to play up to that. I just want to say three things really. One is about the white working class, because I think that stuff in The Guardian today I think is a real eye-opener for people and stuff really. So obviously, you know, the result in Barking and Dagenham was one of the most depressing things during the last election and stuff. But the simple truth is, you see what this is about. This is about utter desperation. This is about working class communities that are completely and utterly politically abandoned, right? And when you've got nobody looking out for you really and stuff, if people come out with shit, but it's something, you'll grab onto it. And so if you do get the B, I mean, I don't know if people read, but it's worth reading the article, right? Because everything in the BNP's leaflet are piles of lies about the number of council houses, the money that's spent, the fact that immigrants, no, so the asylum seekers, are supposed to be paid money to go from Hackney to go and live in Barking. No, it's all rubbish, right? But if you're living in shit and nobody speaks for you, whatever, right, and stuff, then actually you can listen to that. The real point in that argument about that is, how do you start to win that over? Well, Labour's solution is simple. You wrap yourself in a flag and you say that you're as against asylum seekers as anyone else. Be honest, for the BNP can always outdo you on that one. There is an answer. It's to start to fight so those working class communities can have bloody something. They can have something. I'll tell you, one of the best things I saw the other day, we went down to a launch of the book Tell It Like It Is outside number 10 Downing Street. It was really good. There's 100 and odd people there, but one of the best things about it was just at the end, actually it was the Queen's birthday on the day. It was quite interesting. So actually the little truck they tried to get down with the Tell It Like It Is banner was stopped in case it was a bomb and that sort of stuff, right? But there was a dance troupe from Barking and Dagenham, right? People, 14, 15, 16-year-old kids, whatever, right? And it was black kids, Asian kids, white kids, and they stood there in the middle of Whitehall and danced in the middle of the street, even though the police was trying to move them on. And you see, actually, there is hope in areas like that and stuff, but it's about ordinary people coming together and trying to offer some kind of alternative. Just the last two things, really. We are, you know, somebody said it, so this whole country is wave after wave of immigration, right? Jewish, black, people, you know, from, you know, Asians from Uganda and stuff. You go through the thing, Bengali coming into the country. Like I said, man, my way now and stuff. It's Polish. To be honest, you can buy as much Polish tin food, right, and stuff in the shops around my way as you like and stuff, really and stuff. But what it means is and stuff within that, there's always been a culture, on the one hand, of those people being attacked, on the other hand, of working class communities beginning to work together. You saw the strike a couple of months ago and stuff at Heathrow Airport with gate gourmet workers, predominantly Asian women workers, right, and stuff, who came out in support of them, right, and stuff, predominantly white baggage handlers, right, and stuff at Heathrow Airport, who shut down Heathrow Airport. Why? Because it was a question of class. And there's one last thing I wanted to bring up, really, which is a great British tradition that we are in favour of, even if it ain't necessarily the food. And we've created a great British tradition in February 2003. Right, and stuff, and that was 2 million people marching on the biggest anti-war demonstration that we've seen anywhere in the world, right, and stuff. And we're going to have a chance, really, on September the 23rd to re-establish that great British tradition, right? Because the whole world will have a look at what happens in Manchester when the Labour conference happens, because Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, the people who are trying to push this new agenda of the great, you know, valued libertarian society that we live in this country, despite the war and the rest of it, and they'll be putting their argument. We can get literally hundreds of thousands of people onto the streets, white and black, Muslim families, trade unions and the rest of it, right? We can show the other side of what Britain is about. Actually, the radical tradition that people like David Blunkett and others try to take on are the match girl strikers and stuff, and Tom Paine and all the rest of them and stuff. And that's actually the tradition that we're looking to. It's not about Britishness, it's about class, it's about communities working together and beginning to hit back against the people at the top of society, whether it's British society or any other.